Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's MarkMonitor webinar, Effective Strategies for Fighting Counterfeiters in the Digital and Physical World, where we'll be discussing the importance of building a comprehensive anti-counterfeiting strategy that effectively bridges online with on-the-ground enforcement efforts. And I'm Reagan Dermu of MarkMonitor. Now, before we begin our presentation today, I'd like to run everyone through just a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, all participant lines will be muted, and that's simply to ensure that there is no background noise. Following our presentation, we'll be holding a Q&A session, and if you have a question at any time for a speaker during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your question at the end of the session. And for any questions we don't have time to get to today, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the event. Now, we are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slide over the next couple of days. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today's presentation. We're joined by MarkMonitor brand protection expert, Camilla Herron. Camilla began her career as a DEA intelligence analyst. In 2002, she transitioned to supporting corporate anti-counterfeiting programs for leading brands such as Microsoft, Symantec, and Apple. She moved to Monster Cable in 2009 to develop and run their global brand protection program. In her current role, she provides strategic consulting and support for clients in all aspects of their brand protection endeavors. She works closely with clients to provide guidance on various brand protection-related challenges, support on investigative and litigation issues, as well as how to bridge from the digital world into the physical investigative world, working with law enforcement. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Camilla to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. So let's start out with quickly what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover about counterfeiters have moved and continue moving into the online space and into the offline space in the physical world. We'll talk about how this impacts your business and how that impact is increasing. We're going to discuss the importance of developing and having a comprehensive brand protection strategy that spans both the physical and digital worlds. And we will finally close with key building blocks you need for developing a comprehensive strategy to be most effective. Unfortunately, the counterfeiters have become more and more sophisticated over time in their global online operations and also in the physical world by inserting counterfeit products into legitimate supply chains and distribution channels. So counterfeits are ending up in brick-and-mortar retail stores and other physical locations. They fully exploited the internet as far as finding ways to sell their counterfeit. They sell across international marketplaces. They develop and manage large networks of rogue websites selling illegal products. They use social media to direct people to these bad website links. They use paid search terms to promote their sales, and the good old spam. They just go out and advertise. Now, brands have traditionally been initially focused on the online detection and enforcement, but because of the expanding level of the counterfeit online, you need a more comprehensive strategy. And I see the online efforts being actually your first line of defense. You hold down and suppress online sales, and I see this as a defensive strategy. It's more passive. You're not actually pursuing them. You're defending against their activities. Now, with everything changing in the world, you really do need to become more proactive in the physical world where you pursue these parties. You go after them criminally and with litigation to have more impact for your brand protection program. And I really advocate a holistic anti-counterfeiting strategy, which includes both the offense and the defense. So, how does all this impact your business? Everything that we've discussed so far affects your bottom line. By losing more revenue to fraudsters, you've got more quality issues with growing warranty fraud. You've got an increase in customer service volume calls, which can lead to more headcount costs and time being consumed by that group. Increasing diverted website traffic, which equates to stolen sales, and more strained channel relationships, because the counterfeiting impacts not only you, the company, but all of your partners. And by having a very cohesive, broad, proactive strategy in place, you're able to demonstrate to your partners that you're being as proactive as you can to protect their revenue streams. The problems that we've talked about affect your brand reputation. There's brand confusion for the consumers. More and more consumers are having negative customer experiences, which leads to decreased customer satisfaction and ultimately erosion of your customer trust. And all of these things erode your customer base. So moving into the physical space, we're hoping that you'll be more effective. So now we need to talk about what not to do with your brand protection program. A lot of companies do nothing. Some don't even admit they have a counterfeiting problem. Some look at the counterfeiting problem as being too large in scope and scale, and they don't know where to begin. But the counterfeiting is not going to go away, and as we said, it affects your brand reputation, revenues, and your customers. Some companies choose to do online enforcement manually, but with the scale and scope of the increasing sales online, this simply doesn't make sense. You're not going to have any real impact. There's just too many channels and venues to be monitoring effectively. This approach is usually more costly because you've got to use headcount to do it, and like I said, it's less effective in the long run. Some companies operate their brand protection program in a silo. They're not working and integrating with other business units that are actually impacted by the counterfeiting as well. So I advocate working with a team in your company which maximizes the use of your resources and leverages online work to support any offline efforts that you undertake. Don't treat all your infringements equally. Different types of abuse impact your brand and revenue with different force. Be able to prioritize which targets you want to pursue and take action against so you don't waste your time and energy on the small fry. And you just simply can't respond to every instance of infringement. It's just too large a problem. And as budgets shrink with brand protection programs, you need to have more impact, typically usually with less budget. So you need to be more effective. Don't go after the individual eBay seller selling a few units. Go after the individual behind a large rogue website network selling many, many units globally every day. This is why you need to have an anti-counterfeiting strategy in place. Talk about the kinds of foundational things you need to put in place to have a proactive strategy. A foundation on your program is based on being able to gain and having visibility into the scope of the problem, be able to define your strategy and set your objectives clearly so that everyone knows what you're going after. Develop, like I said, a cross-functional team. Work with your other departments. Work with supply chain, quality control, customer service, and your online enforcement team. Stay current with what's happening because certain trends come, certain trends go, and the patterns of activity change over time. Monitor, prioritize, and enforce at both the distribution and promotion points. It needs to be a balanced effort. And then lastly, educate your customers about the counterfeiting problem, your efforts to protect them with your brand protection program, where and how to buy safely. So to develop an offensive and defensive strategy, you need some key building blocks. The first one is actionable intelligence, and I'll explain that shortly in more detail. The next one is investigative reporting, which allows you to go after these groups and individuals criminally as well as civilly with litigation. They contain who's doing what they're doing, where they're doing it, and the scale of their operations. Implement and develop a test-buy program. You need your test buys to support your investigative reports, and without hard physical evidence, law enforcement can't move forward, and neither can attorneys in litigation. And then lastly, we'll talk about partnering with law enforcement. There's certain ways to accomplish this and make it more effective and save you time and effort. And we'll talk about what law enforcement needs from you to be most effective. So let me explain actionable intelligence in more detail. I've created a small, basic chart that shows you the actionable intelligence cycle, some of the steps that we follow when we develop actionable intelligence. Start with your online monitoring enforcement. You aggregate and collect large amounts of data. We collect it in a form that we're able to use it. We then analyze it in detail, select high-value viable targets against whom we can actually take action. We generate full investigative reports, and we support those with test buys. And once you have the investigative report with the test buy, you can then take those to law enforcement attorneys for next steps. Now, some companies only do this once, get a target, and then stop. Other companies just continue to cycle going forward and continue to generate targets that they can line up to attack. So you develop your data from the online work, and you use it in the physical world, which makes you more proactive rather than just defensive. And we feel that by having proactive, offensive, and defensive, it gives your program more balance, maximizes your resources, and you're going to have better impact. Now, when you develop actionable intelligence, you need to understand that data alone is not intelligence. It's just random bits and pieces of information that you aggregate. It only becomes useful intelligence when you examine it, analyze it in detail, rationalize it, putting it in a context, and summarize it in written form so you can use it, which is why you do your investigative reports. The analysts, when they're mining the data, look for various things: the scale of the problem, the worst offenders, identifying criminal networks, patterns of criminal activity, repeat offenders, and all of these things allow you to pursue the criminals rather than be reacting to the criminal's behavior. Once you've developed your actionable intelligence, you need to document it in investigative reports. Certain things you need to do to make your reports comprehensive. Law enforcement are always stretched for resources. So when you do your report, they need to be as comprehensive as you can make them and easy to understand so law enforcement can take these reports, build on them, and hopefully have a good outcome with arrests and prosecutions as the ultimate end goal. These reports identify who is the target, what they're doing, where they're doing it, associates working with them, how long they've been, working on this criminal endeavor, and other information like that. You need to support your investigations with test buys, because without hard physical evidence, law enforcement can't use it, and attorneys cannot file civil litigation. So what do you do once you're done with your reports? You decide you're going to approach law enforcement, and at this point you need to decide which agency is the appropriate agency to go to. You've got the FDA, which if you had pharmaceutical issues, you would go to them. Electrical components or equipment, products that are causing people to be shocked, you could go to Homeland Security investigations. You could go to Customs and Border Protection, and in some instances you can go to the FBI. Now, as I said before, when you do this, all of these agencies have shrinking budgets and resources and changing mandates. So make your reports as impactful and focused as possible. It'll save everyone a lot of time and resources on their end. Once you've established a relationship with law enforcement and or attorneys for litigation, stay engaged with them. Maintain the relationship. Make sure they know who the point of contact is so that when they have questions or need clarification, they know how to go and get that as quickly as possible. Now we need to discuss test buys. So there are certain strategies for setting up test buy programs. Like I said before, you have to have the physical evidence before you can proceed. And my advice is to use an outside third party to obtain the evidence, and they follow all legally required guidelines and initiate chain of custody requirements. Your experienced vendors know how to obtain the products undercover. They know how to process the evidence according to legal guidelines. They know how to store the evidence on your behalf following legal guidelines. And this way, the evidence can't be compromised at trial, No one can claim that you've compromised it if you never touched it. To maximize your spend on test buys, if you identify and go after the larger criminal networks versus the smaller actors, you're going to need to do fewer test purchases, and this actually helps reduce overall costs. A lot of budgets are really, really strained, and asking for test buy money sometimes is very, very difficult. Test buys also can provide a lot of insight into where the products came from, which can lead you into deeper investigations or actually initiate new investigations. It's surprising how many people send the products in with a name or at least an address that you can begin to look at and see where that leads you. So once you've got this and you need to go to law enforcement, there's certain things you need to know. Try and select the proper one. A lot of them actually, if you go to one agency and that's not something that they want to deal with or they handle, they'll refer you to the proper agency. They'll be very helpful. And sometimes there's some overlap. Customs and Border Protection overlaps with Homeland Security investigations and different things like that. There are some pros and cons for working with law enforcement, and sometimes people don't understand these. When you hand over a case to federal law enforcement, they take complete ownership of that investigation. You are not going to know the status or progress on the investigation. By law, they're not allowed to tell you. The only way you're going to know if anything's been done with that is once the case resolves and they're getting ready for prosecution, when they may come back to you asking for clarification, questions, or more information, which can be very frustrating for people. And you're not allowed to take any other action against the target. You're not allowed to initiate civil litigation against these targets once you've handed off the case. Now, there's different levels of law enforcement that you can approach. You can approach federal law enforcement that have these restrictions in place, or in a lot of cases, you can approach local law enforcement if they're willing to take these on. And local law enforcement, I have found in my experience, you're able to stay more in the process and know what's going on with the case. Be sure and have a dedicated person working with the agencies, the agents, or attorneys if you're doing civil litigation. It saves a lot of time when somebody has a question, they know exactly who to come to. They're not asking around, and it makes things just much more smoothly, operating more smoothly. Like I said, the more comprehensive you can make your report, the better supporting evidence you have up front, the easier it's going to be for them to have a successful case. And I found that if you develop a relationship with law enforcement and you bring them very solid cases that they can succeed with, or litigation where they're successful, they're going to be more willing to take on your cases in the future. And these relationships are key. Leverage your partners to get introductions to these different law enforcement agencies. A lot of investigators already have established relationships with agents in various agencies, and they can introduce you and facilitate that. Saves you a lot of time and effort. Plus, if one of the known partners is referring you, I think you get a little more credibility when you go in and bring a case. So, in conclusion, your online enforcement generates a lot of raw data, and most companies are not utilizing that. They're doing online enforcement, and the data is just sitting there, and it's actually wasting it. Take it and leverage it. Maximize your program with it. There's lots of different things you can do with it. If nothing else, it provides you with a lot of business intelligence that your marketing people can look at, and you can find out where the products are being sold, which countries they're being sold in, which currencies they're using, which of your products are more in demand than others, and we've always found that to be very, very helpful. And that also helps you engage with the other business units in your company. When you bring them relevant information, they're more willing to work with you and partner with you and support your brand protection efforts. The actionable intelligence used in the physical world bridges the online and offline worlds. And like we said, it makes you more offensive and proactive. And one of my very, very bright coworkers has a very good little analogy. She says, when you're playing a basketball game, you're playing offense and defense at the same time. So it's a very balanced game. And if you do offense and defense with your brand protection programs, I think you're going to be more balanced and have a much, much more impactful effect against the bad actors. The investigations and investigative reports and test buys all support law enforcement efforts and counsel for litigation purposes. And some companies are reluctant to do either. They're worried about consumer perception if they enforce against people selling counterfeit, bad press, whatever. But I contend that if you actually approach it from a consumer protection standpoint, that you're protecting your loyal consumer base from these bad actors, that people don't react that way. So in summary, that's it. And if there's any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Camilla. That was a great overview. We're now ready to begin our Q&A session. As a reminder, all participants' lines are muted today, so we are not opening up the lines today. For any questions that you have submitted or want to submit, please be sure to send them through the Q&A tab only, and then we'll address them as they come in. So I did see we have some questions that came in during the presentation, so I'm going to take a look at them now. Let's see here. Lots of questions here I see on law enforcement. Camilla, the first one here, what do you have to have prepared before you approach law enforcement?
A comprehensive investigative report that tells the story of how you identified the target, what information you found out about the target, what activities they're participating in, do they have an online presence, a web presence, brick and mortar presence, who are they doing business with, can you identify affiliates, which also leads you to broaden the investigation and also gives you other targets that you can pursue, and hard physical evidence. Now, some people purchase evidence or a test buy before they initiate an investigation. That way they know that their bad actors are actually selling the counterfeit. Some do an initial investigation and start it, then do a test purchase, and if it comes back counterfeit, then continue the investigation. And then many people actually, after the investigation is concluded, perform another test purchase just simply to demonstrate that the criminal activity is going on an ongoing basis.
Great, thank you. And you talked about some test purchases here, so that's a great segue for our next question that came in. And somebody's asking, are test purchases always a necessity?
Actually, yes. You've got to have the evidence. Without that, you can have a brilliant report that's extremely comprehensive and broad, but until you have the evidence, it's just speculation. You haven't proven anything. So you have to have the proof in hand.
And another question is asking about your case. How can you ensure that your case will be actioned?
There's never any guarantee. And so when you approach law enforcement and discuss it with them, as I said, with the federal law enforcement, they'll take it on. But a lot of times, government agencies, mandates change, budgets shift, they have supervisory changes. So even though they've taken your investigation on initially and they're moving it forward, there are things that can actually derail it, which is very frustrating for people. In litigation, I think if you find a law firm that reviews your report, looks at your evidence, finds it all credible and solid, there are firms that are pay for litigation firms. There are also firms that will do litigation on a contingency basis. And that's another reason to leverage your partners, because a lot of times they're the ones that know which law firms will do things on contingency, if that's your choice.
Great, thank you. And I have another question here on criminal investigations. And the person's asking, how long do they typically take? Is there an average amount of time?
That's really hard to predict because, as I said, it depends on the agent's workload. A lot of federal agents have many investigations that they're working concurrently at the same time. If one of their investigations heats up and expands, they're going to need to focus on that. If they go to trial on a certain investigation, they're going to need to focus on that. So, and you're not going to know. Like I said, you're never going to know until there's an outcome, and you just cannot predict it because they can't tell you the progress. They would like to. Investigators I've worked with, I've become friends with them, and they would like to be able to tell me, but they're not allowed to. And so there isn't an average time.
Okay, great. And when do you take a case? Oh, this is a good one, actually. When do you take a case to local law enforcement versus federal level?
Like I said, if it's pharmaceutical or anything health and safety related, medical devices or electronics that are causing people to be electrocuted, Homeland Security will take those on, FDA will take those on. Sometimes you can approach federal law enforcement and they tell you that they can't take your case on. They can't handle it. It's not the right kind for their agency. Then at that point, look to local law enforcement. LA has a dedicated law enforcement unit through the Sheriff's Department that are extremely proactive, and they're focused on counterfeiting. New York also has a task force that's focused on the counterfeiting issue, and you can go there. I've also had, throughout my experience, just random law enforcement from different states and cities who've decided to initiate investigations on their own, who've contacted me for help and support. So though a lot of them can't take it on, there are a lot of them that can. And if you get refused with one, don't be discouraged. Go ahead and try several more because you might get lucky along the way.
Great, thank you. Let's see here if we have any more questions that are coming in to the Q&A. Let's see here. If you haven't had a chance to submit your question yet, feel free to do so at this time.
Okay. So let's talk about what, okay.
Yeah, here we go. What is the best way to interact with the AIC Administrative Law Agency in China in terms of counterfeiters?
It's really interesting because I have some friends and people I know who have tremendous success with the AIC in China. They do literally hundreds of raids with them a year in China. And then I have other people I know who've approached them and they don't have success. And what I have found is it depends on what city and what area in China you're using. And this is also based on relationships. Once you develop a good relationship in China, that will carry you a long way. A lot of people are being discouraged. They go at the AIC and they don't get much traction. The other thing people need to understand about doing any kind of co-work with agencies in China is there's a lot of paperwork they require. A lot of translation is going to be involved, and sometimes that discourages people from working with them as well. Now, I've heard, but I haven't been able to confirm, that the Chinese government is forming 2 new agencies to deal with intellectual property rights in China. I'm not sure if they're up and running yet, and I don't know how this is going to impact the AIC and their local mandate in the future.
Great. Well, thank you, Camilla. I don't think I see any more questions here in the queue, but I do want to thank you for such a great presentation today. Certainly appreciate you sharing your experiences as well as some best practices for our audience. And I'd also like to thank everyone for tuning in for their participation. Your questions always help draw out more information for those listening in. Now, as a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar presentation slides and recording within the next couple of days, so you can be on the lookout for that email. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.